Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us on today's webinar to discuss DevOps and Compliance, how to build the right relationship. My name is Farah Zussman. I'm Director of Customer Success at Anecdotes, and I'll be moderating today's conversation. Traditionally, DevOps teams and compliance teams worked in silos, and while that has never been ideal, at a time when compliance is of growing importance to organizations, there is an urgent need for the two teams to learn to work together in harmony. According to Gartner's DevOps survey, more than 1,000 respondents, DevOps teams are becoming a more cognizant part of compliance, are more cognizant of compliance requirements, with 98% of them working in regulated industries and focusing on an average of 3 compliance frameworks. So how can the two teams better collaborate and ensure that compliance and security are implicitly built into the delivery pipeline? I'm sure you know that it's easier said than done, but that's why we have our incredible panelists here today. So right before I introduce them, I want to remind you that there is a Q&A box and that it's already open. So feel free to share your questions with us, and we'll do our best to get our panelists to answer them later on. So first off, we have Susan Prescott from Cybersecurity, Vulnerability Risk Management, and Governance and Quality Management at AT&T. Thank you so much for joining us today, Susan. Can you tell us a little bit more about yourself? You're on mute.
Thank you. I recently retired early from AT&T, where I worked in the field of cybersecurity and compliance on the GRC and risk management. I have been in various positions in my career, from a chief information protection officer to a security engineer. I kind of went between the positions so I could keep my hands in at all times and stay in touch with everything that was going on. And I've enjoyed a long career, and I'm temporarily retired, I think. I think I'm considering going back soon.
I love that definition. Thank you so much, Susan. We're also glad to be joined by Prabhath Karanth, the Global Head of Security and Trust at TripActions. Can you share a little bit about your background, Prabhath?
Thanks, Triple. Hey, folks, this is Prabhath. I go by PK. I'm the Head of Security and Trust at TripActions. For those of you who are not fully aware of what TripActions does, TripActions is an online end-to-end travel and expense management SaaS platform with over 3,000 employees and 9,000 customers. I run a full spectrum security team here, with my primary obligations being ensuring that we meet the security and privacy obligations to our customers, regulators, investors, and employees as well. I'm a career security guy. I've been in cyber 16 plus years. I was one of the founding members of the Adobe security team, spent 9+ years there building the security function as the business grew from $30 billion to $300 billion in Adobe. And prior to that, I was with PricewaterhouseCoopers doing security Fortune 100 consulting. Prior to that, I was a security engineer in a bank, started my career as a developer. So very fortunate to have landed into security very, very early on in my career, and have been doing this for 16+ years now. And thanks for having me here. I'm super excited to talk about this topic, which I'm really close to.
Amazing. Great. We're super excited to have you with us. Last but not least, we have Donald Tai, Head of Security GRC at TripActions. Thank you so much for being with us today, Donald. Can you also share a little bit about yourself with us?
Yeah, thank you. My name is Donald Tai. I lead the Security GRC function at TripActions. I've been at TripActions for about 1.5 years and have been around the security industry for about 15 years. So prior to joining to TripActions, I spent about half of my time leading security consulting and auditing teams to provide service for startups, PIPO, and Fortune 500 companies. And then I spent the other half on running and building security GRC functions for tech and Fortune 500 companies in the Bay Area. Yeah.
Fantastic. Okay, thank you so much to all three of you, and let's dive right in. So before we discuss how the two teams can collaborate better, we first need to understand a little bit more about the relationship between the DevOps and GRC team operates traditionally. Susan, would you like to kick us off and tell us about the interactions between DevOps and GRC teams?
Sure. So I think GRC teams have typically been more of a control function. I started out in a mainframe world in banking, and that was understood and acceptable in that world. But the world changed and we went to a more distributed environment of openness. And then we moved into, of course, a cloud adoption. And that's just probably not working anymore, but it definitely isn't working anymore. But I do still see a lot of the traditional control function in the field.
Great. Thank you so much. Donald, do you agree with that? Is that how you're experiencing it as well?
Yeah, I think back into my consulting or auditing days, DevOps usually is spread out into silo function like developing operations, infrastructure, and slowly now moving into one team because for more agile development and speed up the process to develop systems, right? So from a GRC perspective, right, instead of dealing with 3 teams, now we're dealing with 1 team. So the relationship definitely has shifted over time. Yeah.
Amazing. Really interesting. Thank you, Donald. Moving on a little bit, Prabhath, why should DevOps teams care about security and compliance?
Well, that's a great question, Tiffany. So I think as Susan and Donald kind of mentioned, even when I started my career, I think it sounds pretty dated now, that DevOps didn't exist, right? There were developers, operators. It was very, very, very different, right? So from a GRC perspective, you had a certain amount of controls that applied to the developers, right? And you had the certain amount of controls that applied to the operation side of the house, right? Now, since both of these functions are coming together, like developers and operators, it's absolutely critical that there are a lot of control attributes. If you look at all of the common compliance requirements, like, name it, right? Like SOC 2, ISO, PCI, HIPAA, FedRAMP, whatever that is, or you combine all of that and have a common controls framework. But a lot of these controls apply in the area of operations for your product and development of your product, right? So for you to actually build customer trust with your prospects and customers and also satisfy your regulatory and commercial compliance requirements, it's absolutely necessary that these folks adhere to these control requirements and standards, right? So if you ask me why should they care, absolutely. I mean, this is how do I put it, right? It's a business enabler. I mean, they have to care. I mean, there's no choice anymore. So it's as simple as that. Yeah.
Right. Really interesting. Thank you so much. Susan, do you have anything to add about why DevOps should care about security and compliance?
Just that customer satisfaction is tied to security, and we often, the GRC often has to show that we are compliant to our customers in order to gain new business and to maintain existing business. And as a result of that, we often get certifications, and in order to meet those certifications, we have to have those controls in place. So they do need to care, because otherwise the products will not be purchased consistently or at the rate they should be, or they will not be maintain their customer base.
Fantastic.
And just to add to that, there's another element to this, right? One is customer trust and compliance, but looking at the overall security posture and hygiene, now this is where, DevOps and DevSecOps, right? These are actually maintaining your infrastructure where production, code gets deployed to production, right? They maintain the CI/CD pipelines and so on and so forth. So if you don't have the right security controls in place around this infrastructure and the right processes in place from a, kind of overall from a people, process, and technology perspective, then that could be a single point of failure from an overall security posture and hygiene perspective as well. So there is, of course, the compliance and the customer trust angle, and then there is also a pure security angle here from a security risk management perspective, which, if not handled appropriately, can lead to ultimately like a business risk for the company. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you. And if we move on to kind of a different aspect of this, Donald, how does leadership see the relationship between the two teams?
So I think a lot of times the GRC team or the DevOps team may report to the same leader. It could be the engineering or CTO. So I think for them at their level, they usually cares about are we able to prioritize the compliance requirement and the work in the right manner, right? So, and then also keeping the cost manageable whenever compliance requires something, the DevOps team to do certain things. And then also DevOps team also needs to make sure that they are meeting all the customer commitments, right? So I think at that level, right, that's usually what the leadership cares about. Yeah. And maybe PK, or oh, sorry, PK is the head of security, right? So he usually have a better view than I do. Right? So yeah.
Amazing. So in that case, PK, how do you experience leadership's relationship with the teams?
Donald always has amazing views about these topics. He's very seasoned. But overall, see, if the way this works is, if you look at leadership, look at the primary objective, right? You're looking at business leadership. Their primary objective is to enable the business, to make sure business objectives are met, right? For the investors of the company and overall for all the stakeholders in the company, right? And operational excellence, right? That's another key aspect from an overall leadership angle, right? From a leadership objective angle, right? Business excellence, operational excellence, and so on and so forth. Now, keeping that mindset, they are, of course, as Susan mentioned, that they would want all the compliance requirements to be met, right? Because if not, it's hard to, go to market in new regions or enable business, or it's also going to block revenue, right? Now, at the same time, the DevOps and the DevSecOps folks, they have a primary objective, which is around, operational excellence, enabling the business, enabling the developers, and also maintaining a security environment. Whereas the compliance and the risk management function is more focused around security objectives, risk management, meeting the compliance goals, right? So from a leadership perspective, this analogy has changed over the years. But the trend that I'm noticing currently is that they want the right balance between like operational excellence and the controls and risk management, right? Because if you don't have the right balance, then you're really hindering the business. And if you're taking too much risk, then also you're hindering the business, right? So getting that balance is absolutely critical, if you ask me. Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you. Thank you. So I think now we have a little bit of a better understanding of what the relationship between DevOps and GRC teams look like currently and why it's important that it improves. So let's move to understand the challenges that these teams face daily. Donald, can you tell us about the main points of friction between the teams and why you think they occur?
So a lot of times frictions occurred when both teams have different priorities. And then also a lot of times from my experience as a GRC leader, the compliance requirements add additional cost to the DevOps team. And that will create frictions, right? As usually one of the objective is to maintain the cost for the process and function at a manageable manner. So usually these are the reasons that are creating frictions.
Interesting. Susan, what about you? What challenges do you see from the DevOps side when trying to account for security and compliance needs?
Well, I don't think that GRC's value is completely understood. It's sometimes seen as a roadblock. And DevOps is seen as they're agile developers and they just need to get the things done. But if they had a more collaborative approach, then they wouldn't be just enforcers. And if they maintain that status as enforcers, I don't think it's going to be accepted going forward, especially with the merging of the teams. We also have as Don mentioned, the costs those costs need to be accounted for early in the development lifecycle and budgeted for. And that system development lifecycle needs to have those things included in them, and that will help. But GRC is not typically, in what I've seen outside of banking anyway, in the development lifecycle.
Really, really good point. Thank you. Prabhath, what do you think, and how do you see the challenges from the compliance side when working with a DevOps team?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So this has evolved over time, right? So back when I started my career, I was, I started in the on-prem days, and now for the last decade or so, I've been working in modern SaaS companies with API-first infrastructure and all of that. So the way I think about this is, if you look at most of the compliance, kind of regimes, right, without naming any, they have still not adopted completely to the modern SaaS API-first ecosystem, okay? I mean, of course, they need to cater for several other industries like banking, insurance, all of that. But generally, right, the evolution of these frameworks has not happened at the pace at which the technology landscape has evolved, okay? It's not kept up with the technology disruption. So as a result of that, naturally what happens is the interpretation, right? The compliance teams and the GRC teams, they interpret these, control requirements and then translate it to the DevOps and the DevSecOps folks, right? Which sometimes creates conflicting objectives, because think about it, the way these control requirements are written are a little dated, whereas technology has really evolved. I mean, DevSecOps, DevOps is just moving at a rapid pace to enable the business. So there is a little bit of friction created because the objectives are not fully aligned, right? So that kind of creates this friction point, I feel. And I think the way I've seen my teams kind of overcome this is to really understand their world, The same controls can be applied in their world, but you just need to speak their language, right? You need to speak that overall, the CI/CD, kind of like a continuous deployment and automated deployment and access related language, right? So when you do that, you just understand where you apply those control attributes in this modern era, right? And then it can still meet those control requirements overall by doing that, right? So yeah, the friction point, I mean, I gave you several. I was trying to walk the audience through my thinking here, but the traditional approach has created these friction points, which can be overcome. I'm sure we're going to talk about that in the subsequent questions. Yeah, so I don't want to get too much into that.
Absolutely, thank you. So yes, I do want to move for a moment to the next part of the puzzle, right? So far you've helped us understand and helped our audience understand the daily challenges that these two teams face and why they both need each other in order to ultimately succeed. So let's dive into how DevOps and compliance can better work together. Susan, what are some strategies you've used to create a better relationship? Do you have some examples that you can share on how you created better communication with the two teams?
I do have an example. I was working on a security product development, and the DevOps team, the development team actually, we had a chance to get with them early, and we recommended that they follow the OWASP guidelines, and they did. And we also gave them tools to do vulnerability assessments early in the testing environment, in the development environment. So when they finally delivered the code to go into production, there was very little wrong with it, and we were able to move swiftly. Giving them those tools and those guidelines early, they were able to take control themselves without a lot of oversight. It was about getting to them early and having them be aware, and they were very good about it. And it was about the communication.
Great, thank you, Susan. Prabhath, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so I think my thoughts has again evolved over time, but the one strategy that I feel is extremely successful is that see, the compliance and GRC folks, they come from several backgrounds, right? Some come from a developer background, some come from consulting background, some come from risk management background, some come from auditing backgrounds. I've worked with all kinds of folks, right? So I think it's very critical that irrespective of what professional background you're coming from, it's absolutely critical that you adopt and learn the modern tech stack, right? With the cloud first, microservices-based, distributed architecture, API-based, how it actually works. It works very differently than how things used to work like several years back and in on-prem world, right? So once you understand deeply, and I would encourage everybody to understand as deeply as the DevOps engineers, right, to that level, right, then you can really relate to their world and empathize with them, right, and then really help them in a better way from a people, process, and technology perspective. So I think in a lot of areas, it requires a shift in mindset, right? And of course, a little bit of heavy lifting from a learning perspective, and that will automatically, kind of trend towards solving all these friction points in the long run. Yeah.
Thank you. Donald, do you have also any examples to add here of ways to create better communication between the two teams?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, buy donuts to the DevOps team, right? Create a report, right? See, I mean, it helps, this kind of little things, right? And also as the security GRC team, we need to do our homework, right? We're going to do our homework in a way that we need to understand the regulations, understand the framework, what they ask, right? Because a lot of times these regulations and framework kind of developed like in the early days, as PK mentioned before. So they don't consider the DevOps model when they develop all these frameworks. So we need to do our homework by talking to the regulators, by talking to the auditors, and understand, and also make them aware that, hey, in a DevOps world, in a DevOps process function, this is how we can adjust those risks, how we can adjust those requirements. After we get the agreement with those regulators and auditors, then we can bring those back to the DevOps team, right? And tell them that, hey, this is exactly what the auditors and regulators are looking for. And then also at the same time, we need to be cautious about their priorities and also their cost. So a lot of times, what I've seen the compliance team have not done enough is give enough timeline or heads up to the DevOps team, right? I always make sure my team to let the DevOps team know that, hey, they need to do this maybe in the next quarter, not in the next 2 weeks, right? And then also find a solution that they agree on and also is feasible for them to implement. So there's a couple of strategies, yeah. But start with donuts.
Yeah, I agree that donuts will solve 90% of your problems, and what donuts can solve, advanced communication will. So 100%. That's amazing. Thank you so much, Donald. Prabhath, what are ways that the changing nature of DevOps impacts the need for regulatory compliance?
Yeah, I would say that that's a good question. So I would flip that question around, right? So I think, most of these compliance requirements, regulatory and commercial compliance requirements, the control language is written based on the risk, right? So there is a risk attribute, and I mean, if you look at a typical CISSP domain, there are 10 domains in cyber, 10 or 12 domains. So out of that, there are like several risks across these domains, people, process, and technology, and that's how these control attributes are written, right? Now, the risk landscape is changing though, with the modern tech, kind of ecosystem with SaaS and API first. The risk landscape is drastically changing. So that automatically requires a shift in mindset around how these control objectives and attributes are kind of drafted and interpreted and implemented, okay? So that is, kind of my response to your question. I think that, if the regulatory or if these frameworks are not able to catch up with the technology disruption, then I think that's a very unique opportunity for GRC teams to actually add that additional value to interpret these requirements and then be a trusted business partner with the DevOps and the DevSecOps teams, where you help them understand that, oh, by the way, you can meet PCI compliance. You may not be exactly able to meet these control languages the way it's written, but you can meet the intent, and that way we can prove to the auditors that we are satisfying these control objectives, right? So that is the shift in mindset I'm talking about.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. And great insights. Susan, how do you experience this, the ways in which the changing nature of DevOps impacts the need for regulatory compliance?
Well, regulations are constantly increasing, and I don't think that DevOps needs to keep up with them. If the relationship is a collaborative relationship between GRC and DevOps, they can have a symbiotic relationship and have Dev can have GRC work for them and have them prepare for audits, to pass audits and certifications. And audits can be used to identify needs that they have and get funding as well. So I think if it's more of a symbiotic relationship where they are mutually beneficial, they can make a mutually beneficial relationship instead of that control, demand, you must do this. And as was it Prabhath who said that we need to make sure that we have people that are looking at continuous improvement. And I think DevOps can really utilize GRC, and GRC needs to, as Prabhath said, get a little bit more open to some of the solutions, that they don't have to be as prescriptive.
Great, thank you. Donald, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I 100% agree with Susan and Prabhath. So I think DevOps, as I mentioned in the beginning of this webinar, is DevOps pretty much is a new way of combining three functions: developing, operation, and maintaining the infrastructure into kind of one team or one function, right? From a compliance and regulation standpoint, that creates a lot of headache around access management, around approvals, documentation, and things like that. So I think we need to be a little bit creative and innovative on how to capture those documentation as well as compensated controls, right, to present to the regulators and auditors, and also make them aware that what the requirements or compliance framework, the risk they're trying to address, we will try to address in a different way, right? Instead of directly like one-to-one doing what the requirements said, exactly right, as Prabhath mentioned. Yeah.
Great, thank you, Donald. And I actually just want to take a minute to remind the audience that you can share your questions with us, and we will get to them in a minute or so. And now, just coming back to Donald, how can technology be used to create less friction between the two teams?
Technology definitely can help, right? I think technology is the only way to kind of reduce the friction, right? Technology can help basically deprioritize the task for both teams, because it managed to grab the information, right? That is needed for requirements already, right? That absolutely technology can do, right? So that nobody needs to spend time back and forth to discuss what we need to do, and that's where technology can really can help. But well, technology cannot buy donuts. We still need to buy donuts.
Excellent point.
Yeah. I missed it this morning, so
I'm going out to buy some after this, because
I actually had a table outside of my office with bagels and cream cheese and butter, so that people would come, and I had a glass window and people would come to get them, and then I'd have the opportunity to talk to them about some of the important things, and it worked great. Also, going to the gym, when you know certain people are at the gym that you need to speak to. I played squash and I didn't know how to play squash. but I played squash with somebody that I needed to work with and understand what I did, and it worked very well. Or got on the treadmill next to her.
So I couldn't agree more that those kinds of low-tech interactions are also critical. But have you seen situations where technology also helps better the two teams' relationship, Susan?
Oh, absolutely. I think we need more tools for observability. We let the processes automate and run, but GRC should be really watching those things and building in fail-safes. So what we don't want is unauthorized changes to production, correct? So if we don't want unauthorized changes to production, and we need to have speed is very important to the development, and we need to have like break the glass type of situation. I actually had one time in a data center where you would break the glass to get the ID and the password. And then when you go use that ID and password, it actually makes sure that they know who's there, who's using that. There's certain controls in place so that no one gets woken up in the middle of the night. No one gets stopped other than to break the glass. Could use that figuratively as well. And you can tell the next morning what happened and review it then. And every time the glass was ever broken, it was on the up and up. There was nothing that was done, but they got the speed. And that's what the GRC needs to be cognizant of, is the speed. And that's where the tools can bring us speed.
Really insightful. Thank you. Prabhath, do you have any examples you've seen throughout your career?
Yeah, so I think most of the folks in the audience probably heard of this concept called shifting security and compliance to the left of the development lifecycle. So I think what that typically means is, it's to summarize whatever Donald and Susan were mentioning, identify the right tools and processes and build observability from a GRC and a compliance perspective, right? And a security perspective. So if you have all the controls baked in an automated fashion, and if the GRC team is watching from an observability perspective and collecting evidences using a continuous automation kind of a solution, or a controls automation kind of a solution, then that's it. I mean, that is it, right? So you're using the the modern tooling stack, the DevSecOps tooling stack, to collect evidences and controls automation to satisfy control requirements. And that is, it's easy to say all this, but in practice, it takes a lot of effort to implement. But once you get this right, then you can take the benefits are massive. I think the benefits are massive. You can get to a point where you test once, get multiple, kind of results across frameworks and all of that. If you have a common controls framework, it's even better, because then you have the common control objectives for which you're collecting evidences. Then you're testing those controls once and then meeting multiple compliance regimes, right? So, of course, from an ROI perspective, this really drives operational excellence, because you have one single audit, right? You have one audit firm, you have one control set, right? And meeting multiple requirements. So it also reduces the operational overhead for both DevOps and the GRC teams. And overall, from a business value perspective, you're able to provide the maximum value to the business in a way that you can actually position the GRC and the security function as a business enabler, right? And a revenue function, and not as a cost function. Yeah.
Yeah, and I want to add one more thing, right? Because nowadays DevOps process have a lot of tools involved. So technology can definitely help to manage the access, right? And the access rights for all these tools, and give a better view, right? A consolidated view to the regulators, to the compliance team, and to the security management as well. Yeah.
Susan, it looks like you might have something to add.
Prabhath, you brought up some interesting points when you were speaking before and just recently. The various backgrounds of the GRC and the many languages that comes with those various backgrounds I hadn't thought about before, actually, in order to come to terms where we can all understand each other. So that was insightful for me. Also, I think that you're testing once and satisfy many is a very important point, because that takes a lot of time away from the development and DevOps, from those people and the engineers, to satisfy this, provide the same evidence over and over again for different audits and certifications. That is a very important point that we need to, as GRC specialists, to take home and apply. Thank you for that.
Thank you so much. Thank you, all of you. It's time to take a couple of questions from our audience. So thank you to everyone who sent questions in. Before we start, I just want to say that if we don't get to your question, we will make sure to get you an answer. So our first question is, what do you wish you knew starting out your career working with different stakeholders like the DevOps team? This is directed to all of you. So Susan, do you want to start us off?
Well, as I said, I started off my career in banking, and it was a pretty controlled environment. What I didn't know was that when I started working with other types of companies, they wouldn't have those kinds of controls in place, and I just expected them to be there. And if I had known that it was, in a lot of the industries, they weren't doing that, I would have taken a different approach to start.
Stayed in banking.
Oh, there you go.
Fantastic. Yeah. Prabhath, anything to add?
So I kind of missed the question. I cut out there for a second. What is the question again?
Yeah, sure. What do you wish you knew when you were starting out your career working with different stakeholders like DevOps teams?
Got it. So yeah, I think I'm very fortunate. I started off as a developer and I got into security within the first year of my professional career. So I consider myself extremely fortunate. It was not planned. It was it happened by accident, but I just kind of hung on to that, right? But overall, based on the themes that I've gathered from my journey over the last 16 years, is that I would say that having experience, I started off as a developer, then as a security engineer, then I was a consultant for some time. Then I spent 10 years in Adobe, where I did everything under security you could think of. And now I'm running security here at TripActions. So having that diverse experiences, right, is very critical, right? Especially in the security game and the security profession and the security business. And the reason I say that is because as a security leader in a company, you're in a very unique position where you're able to influence every function in the company and ultimately influence business in a way that not a lot of people can do, okay? Because there's a revenue angle, there's a risk management angle, there is an operational excellence angle, there are all kinds of angles here, right? So when you play those different roles in your career, or when you work in those different teams and different functions, you get a developer mindset, right? You get an operator mindset, you get a risk management mindset. I've also worked as an auditor in the past. You get an auditor mindset, and then you get a mindset of a business leader. So having those experiences is, I would say, very helpful, because then you automatically can cater to the needs of your business partner and your customer, right? So yeah, that's what I would say. Yeah, I think this is something that, fortunately, it happened to me accidentally throughout the journey. But if I'd known this is how I would have planned it. So yeah.
Amazing. So that's very good advice to anyone listening in. Donald, do you have anything that you'd like to add about things?
Yeah. So I don't think I wish I'd known before starting my career, but I think all the compliance folks needs to know. And needs to continue to practice the different languages to talk to different teams, right? They need to be educated and themselves, and they need to also understand the language of different teams. Is really important, right? And I had a mentor when I was back in my security consulting and auditing days. My mentor once told me that he considered himself as a translator, because as a compliance person, we talk to, is a security and compliance person, we talk to a lot of different teams in the companies and at different levels, right? So we're basically translating all the requirements from the regulation, from the regulatory to those folks, right? At different levels, doing different types of work. We need to talk to their language, right? So that they can understand what we're looking for and be successful and help the whole organization to be successful.
Well, okay, our next question relates exactly to your answer, Donald, and you've kind of already given your take on it. So the question is, are there differences in languages between the two teams? Susan, do you want to kind of get us started, or follow up rather, on that one?
So Prabhath made me think more about that, because people do come from different backgrounds. There's more than 2 languages, there's many languages. And I even see that in amongst the GRC teams themselves speak different languages because they have so many different backgrounds. And I hadn't thought about that as much. So the most successful I've ever been was when I started a position where the first week, the secretary of the person that hired me had set me up to spend an hour with each of the heads of departments, including legal and HR, DevOps, development, operations, all the different disciplines. And I got to have lunch with them and learn what makes them lose sleep at night. And when you learn that, what makes people lose sleep at night, what their biggest challenges are, then you can go forward, and when you work with them and when you're thinking about what you're implementing, you can address those things.
Yeah, definitely. And Prabhath, if I can get your take on it.
So what is the question again?
What are there differences in languages between the two teams, which I think we've established, certainly, that there
I think
are.
I spoke about this.
Exactly. But yeah, is there anything else you have to add on that topic?
Yeah, my only addition here would be is that for I think most of the audience here is GRC folks, right? So from a GRC perspective, you have to have a mindset of a technologist and also as a business operator, right? It's not just a pure technology play, because a lot of these controls span across people processes, right? They span across legal, privacy, tech, all of that stuff, right? So from that perspective, I think it's important to have a very open, irrespective of the background you're coming from, just because of the nature of your profession. I think it's very, very important to have a very open mindset to embrace these different kind of, thinking, right, for these different teams. So I would say that it's more on the GRC folks to actually adopt to the DevOps mindset and kind of understand where they're coming from and then partner with them, because most of the folks in the engineering side, they have just one goal, right? They have either like a feature development or like enabling, building, maintaining the CI/CD pipeline or maintaining the site reliability or observability and so on and so forth, right? But just the nature of this GRC work is so diverse that I think I would encourage everybody to, kind of adopt the mindset that each of these different professions come from and partner with these folks. So I think that way we can bridge the gap, right? Bridge the gap that the person is talking about here. So hopefully that answered the question.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you so much. There's still a few more questions, but unfortunately, that's all we have time for today. I wanted to thank Susan, Prabhath, and Donald for joining us, for your great insights. I know that I leave here with a much better understanding of how the two teams of DevOps and compliance operate.
I think there is one question on the chat, right, which I would like to, it's a very, very good question. So if you have a second, I would like to, just address that. I think the question is, how does budget gets affected when concerning security and compliance needs for DevOps? Are VP engineering allocating time and money for these efforts? Okay, so this is a very very, very timely question considering the macroeconomic situations and all, right? So, and the reason I want to address this is I've specifically, thought about this several times in most of the places that I worked in, and I've come up with, various strategies. Some of them have worked, some of them have not. So I want to share some learnings here. So one suggestion that I have here is, like, based on the industry that you're coming from, try and, like, your compliance certification are your biggest business enabler, right? For example, in TripActions, members of my team have a seat in the table or have a stake in every major enterprise deal, right? Because this comes up, the security conversation comes up during third-party risk assessments and enablement and so on and so forth. So one strategy that works is when you can try and, tie your compliance efforts and enablement efforts back to revenue, right? that language really works, because when you go to the management and say, hey, this is the amount of revenue that we are able to enable because of our compliance program, because of our enablement program, trust program, then there's no question. I think folks will buy in automatically. So it's as simple as that. Yeah.
Amazing. And I just want to give, the other panelists a chance to answer the same question. How does budget get affected when concerning security and compliance needs for DevOps and our VPs of engineering allocating time and money for these efforts? Susan, if you have any thoughts on that.
So I think, they really need to understand what it is that GRC does, and the certifications that we often get and apply cost money. But when you have requests for proposals coming in and you provide that, and that helps to win business, you can count that business as something that you enabled. Yeah. You have to know the numbers though, and we don't always know the numbers, so you have to ask, and you might have to dig to get them. But if you have to communicate to them in order for them to budget appropriately, and I think that's the key. Again, communication.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Susan. Donald, anything to add? Yeah,
absolutely. So 100% agree with Susan and Prabhath and PK. I just have a quick example, right? Like in my experience, a lot of times the discussion with DevOps is about the storage of the logs. Since for compliance, we always want them to keep logs for over a year. So a lot of times it becomes a cost concern for that team, right? So I think we need to understand the different types of storage, and then also understanding if other teams outside of DevOps team can help store those information with a lower budget, right? We have those information in place, you will have a much better conversation with the DevOps team and also meeting the compliance objective.
Thank you so much. And thank you, PK, for interjecting and raising that question to all of our attention. We are at the end of our time, so I just want to quickly summarize what we discussed about how crucial it is for DevOps and compliance teams to work together in harmony, and how to make sure security compliance is built into the delivery pipeline. I want to thank our incredible panelists for all their insight, and of course to our audience for joining us today and for all of your great questions. If you have any more, feel free to reach out to us and we'll make sure to get you an answer, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you for having us. We appreciate it.